Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us on this webinar, Addressing Anti-Blackness on Campus. I'm Frank Harris III and have the pleasure of co-facilitating this webinar with three esteemed colleagues who I would like to take a moment to introduce. Next slide. First is Dr. Regina Stanback-Stroud, who serves as Chancellor of the Peralta Community College District in California. With more than 35 years of experience in education as a Chancellor, President, Vice President, Dean, and Professor, Dr. Stanback-Stroud is highly regarded at local, regional, state, and national levels for her knowledge, background, and perspective on student equity and diversity, education industry collaboratives, economic empowerment, anti-poverty strategies, community workforce, and economic development, and regional and state system policy implications for successful programs and services. Next, we have Lasana Hotep, who serves as Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the founding executive director of the Equity Institute at Skyline College, where he created and oversaw equity academies that provide team-centered professional development experiences for educational and corporate professionals interested in becoming more culturally fluent and equity advancing within their organizations. His most recent book, Minding the Obligation Gap in Community Colleges and Beyond, was published this month by Peter Lang Publishing. And finally, we have Dr. J. Luke Wood, who serves as Vice President of Student Affairs and Campus Diversity and a Distinguished Professor of Education at San Diego State University. His research focuses on advancing the success of Black boys and men in education. He has delivered over 1,000 scholarly and conference presentations and has 150 publications to his credit, including 70 more in peer-reviewed journals, articles, and books. Next slide. There are four objectives for today's webinar. First, we're going to spend some time discussing the history and legacy of anti-Blackness in U.S. schools, colleges, and universities. We're also going to talk about the deleterious effects of anti-Blackness and the effects that it has on the well-being and success of Black children, students, and educators. We're going to talk about the critical role that educational leaders play in eradicating anti-Blackness. And then finally, we're going to propose a point plan for addressing anti-Blackness in schools, colleges, and universities. Now, throughout the webinar, we encourage you to share your thoughts on social media, thoughts and reflections that emerge as you engage the content, and we invite you to use the hashtag Black Minds Matter in doing so. There will also be time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. You can post your questions on Zoom, in the comment sections on YouTube, or via Twitter, again, using the hashtag. Now, please keep in mind that there are more than 13,000 registrants for this webinar, so we can't get to every question that will be asked. But what we'll try to do is keep our responses relatively brief so we can get to as many questions as possible. And if you're able to, it would be helpful if you can direct your questions to a particular panelist, because that'll help us just get through as many questions as we can. Next slide. There are a few disclaimers that we'd like to offer in advance of sharing the content of this webinar. First, this is an introduction to anti-Blackness. And while we believe that the insights that we have to share will really help to advance your understanding of anti-Blackness and its impact, by no means will this one webinar make you an expert. So there's much more intentional work that will need to be done following today's conversation. The next disclaimer is that some of the issues and strategies that we'll present will be very context specific, meaning that they'll be specific to a K-12 district or a community college or a university, but quite a few of them will also be cross-cutting as well. And then lastly, since we are, in some ways going to be toggling in our discussion between schools, colleges, universities, and districts, when we use the word institutions, we're talking about educational institutions, in a broadly defined way. Next slide. Now, unfortunately, there are many people who believe that our fight for social justice and against systemic racism actually began last month with the murder of George Floyd. And to this, we say that it is really important to recognize that Black lives in the US have been suffocated by issues of racial injustice for centuries. And what we see here is a snapshot of the racialized oppressions and injustices and violence that have been enacted towards Black lives since the US was colonized. Now, let me say this, by no means is this an exhaustive list, but perhaps what this does is helps us understand why Black people and Black allies are so angry and frustrated. And when people have been suffering and begging for equality for so long with very little progress, negotiation and diplomacy no longer seem like viable options. Instead, the only viable option is to fight. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to transition. We're going to transition to Lasana Hotep, who's going to provide us with a brief primer on what is anti-Blackness. And we're going to take it from there. Lasana.
As Frank alluded to, is that it did not start with our brother George Floyd being murdered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But one of the key important things is that we're going to talk about anti-Blackness broadly and then get more specific into the conversation about education. Because when we talk about education, we have to ask ourselves the question, how could this young man attend school and this young man attend school? And we are seeing some definitely disproportionate outcomes for the African-American student. How could this young lady attend the school and this young lady attend the school? And we see difference in the treatments of behavior and expectations. A lot of folks like to attribute this to the individual student or the family or the household and the communities that the students come from. And though all of those play a role, the students don't have a role in some of these things that we see that are institutional. When you look at data and you see that Black children at white schools are more likely to be told they have learning disabilities. Or when you see a situation that Luke will cover later, addressing the issue about Black male suspensions in our great state of California. And speaking about our great state of California, addressing the issue that we built 22 prisons and only one university since 1980. And so these are institutional things. These are things that have very little to do with the individual person. When people like to come from the deficit model and blame the individual or the communities, we see that the individuals and communities do not make these types of decisions. So what does it mean to deal with anti-Blackness, and what is anti-Blackness? For today's discussion, we're going to use the definition from the Council of Democratizing Education, and it defines anti-Blackness as being a two-part formation that both voids Blackness of value and systematically marginalize Black people in our issues. You have overt anti-Black racism and you have covert anti-Black racism. And the covert anti-Black racism is held up by anti-Black policies, institutions, and ideologies. And so when we examine it from here, we have to be able to pull back at more of a macro level to ask ourselves, how did we get here? And what are some manifestations of anti-Blackness that we see in contemporary times? And so when you look at anti-Blackness, when it began to emerge in the United States of America, post-slavery, the enslavement of African people, you see the dehumanization in the rise of things like minstrel shows. And you see the phenomena of blackface come into play. And this phenomena, it seeks to make caricatures out of Black people. And then when you look into the early days of cinema in the United States of America, the quintessential groundbreaking film of all time is The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. One thing people don't understand is that if you go to any type of cinema course or any type of cinema program, they will say that this is the cornerstone foundational film for modern filming techniques in cinema. Yet the heroes of the film are the Ku Klux Klan. And then you have the phenomenon of lynching, where Black people were burnt at the stake, hung by nooses, dragged through the streets, and murdered in these public performances that cost Black people's lives. In this particular flyer talks about 3,436 Black people were lynched. And those are documented lynchings between 1889 and 1921. And then you have this phenomena that a lot of people aren't aware of, where a Black man named Ota Benga, and this is a cover of a book, so feel free to go look up the book, was held in the Bronx Zoo in the early 1900s. And he was held as a quote unquote type of an ape. And that's why they have a picture of him holding a chimpanzee. And this kind of dehumanization is beyond the pale of what we talk about in inclusive and also other types of diversity work about things that are specific to Black people. So we're not saying that other people do not experience racism and have not experienced racism, but anti-Black racism is a particular kind. But you could say, Lasana, this is all back in the days. This is right after antebellum. What about today? Well, today, we're still dealing with this issue of blackface. This is a young college girl on TikTok who was trying to make fun of her African-American peers and put blackface on and stuffed her shorts, her sweatpants to make fun of Black women. And then you have, as of recent of 2019, the rise of hate organizations, just like the rise of the Ku Klux Klan after Birth of a Nation. And when you talk about lynchings, one of the reasons why we're having these conversations here is because of the likes of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, and so many others. And then when you talk about the issue of us being compared to apes, this is from an ad in 2017 where H&M had a young African in a hoodie that said "coolest monkey in the jungle." And so if you have an understanding of this history, the anti-Blackness we're talking about, one of the reasons why it has not come to a head is because we have not addressed it directly. We have not put a stop to it. And until we are able to put a stop to it, then it's going to continue to blossom, flourish, and morph into many different manifestations. But it shouldn't come as a shock that tropes, stereotypes, and dehumanizing characterizations that had their beginnings in the mid 1800s are still manifesting themselves today, even though we have interpreted ourselves as progressing as a society. So where do these ideas come from? And one of the interesting things I found within history is that a lot of these ideas about racial hierarchies came at the time of the so-called Enlightenment. And so someone might ask, well, how could you have these ideas of hierarchy when you have the time of enlightenment? And so based on an article that was published about what we're dealing with in terms of anti-Blackness through the Enlightenment, it says it took the scientific thought of enlightenment to create an enduring racial taxonomy and the color-coded white over Black ideology, which we're familiar with. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach's influential 1776 volume on the natural varieties of mankind posited 5 divisions of humanity, beginning with Caucasians. These frameworks evolved into theories of racial difference developed to square a conceptual circle. If natural rights are universal, if everyone has the capacity to reason, then what is the explanation for enslaved Africans or savages in the Americas who do not seem to act and reason like white Europeans? The answer is biological inferiority in accordance to these racial classifications. Continuing on, when you have Enlightenment thinkers that a lot of us reference in the humanities, people like Immanuel Kant. And when you look at Immanuel Kant, it says he sketched out a more formalized racial hierarchy in his own anthropological work. And this is a quote from Kant: "Humanity exists in its greatest perfection in the white race. The yellow Indians have a smaller amount of talent. The Negroes are the lower and lowest part of the American peoples." So this is what we mean by anti-Black racism, this particular racism that has created a hierarchy of human beings, placing people who have been classified as white at the top, people who have been classified as Black and at other times Negro at the bottom. And there being stratifications of people on how close they are to whiteness, or how far they are from Blackness in organizing people within societies and communities. And as you can see, this particular graph here has the white person or the Caucasian, then the so-called Negro, and then the chimpanzee, comparing the Black to the chimpanzee. And so when it comes to education, a lot of people are wondering, why are you having this conversation in context of education? And why are you bringing race into education? And I treat all my students the same. I see all my students the same. I don't make any distinction between my students. But we have to understand that folks like us aren't the ones who have brought race into education, and that race has been into education, of course, beginning with the Eugenics movement. And for those who don't know what the Eugenics movement is, it's a study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. It's developed largely by Franz Galton as a method of improving the human race. You know, interesting that the definition says that it only came into disfavor after the perversion of it by the Nazis, but its beginning in and of itself was to categorize a better human and a less valuable human, and that was based on the hierarchies of this false notion called race. And so when you talk about education, and you talk about anti-Blackness and the dehumanization of people of African ancestry in education, you have to talk about Lewis Terman. Terman is best known for developing the Stanford Binet IQ test, a development which made him and Stanford University well known throughout the United States. Terman's interest in intelligence, however, was not. It was motivated and shaped by Terman's deep belief in eugenics, right? And so when you have the standardized test for measuring human intelligence created by someone who believed in a theory of white superiority and every other group's inferiority, with an emphasis on Black people being compared to chimpanzees and apes. And then you have to talk about Carl C. Brigham. He's the father of the SAT. And so this is a test that now everyone's celebrating that major universities are getting rid of as a measure. But for millennia, we use this particular standardized assessment and basing all of the assessments that we're doing, P12 all the way through, on these types of tests that were created by, yes, eugenicists, by people who were white supremacists. Carl C. Brigham, the father of SAT, became interested in mental testing while a student at Princeton. He later became a psychology professor at the university, where he was an enthusiastic member of the eugenics movement. One of the reasons why I'm showing you this is because we like to think of people who are racist or people who have racialized notions as being people of a particular type, of a particular class, that live in a particular region of the United States of America. These are the learned people. These are the Stanfords and the Princetons. These are people who put these structures in place and codified and published and built careers off of this type of thinking. And so when you see a student post a tweet like this, colleges be like, we are against institutionalized racism. Baby, you are the institutionalized racism. There's a lot of merit to that, because colleges, universities, and P12 systems have not examined themselves along the lines of what role do they play in what we call the weaponization of education, and especially the weaponization of education in terms of anti-Blackness. So what do we mean when we talk about the weaponization of education? To weaponize something is to use something in order to deliberately inflict harm on a people, right? And some people might say, well, this all happened just by happenstance and by circumstance, but I have evidence to the contrary. When you look at Self-Taught, a book by Heather Andrea Williams, she talks about education during the enslavement of Black people. And she says, masters made every attempt to control their captives' thoughts and imaginations, indeed their hearts and minds. Maintaining a system of bondage in the age of enlightenment, as I referred to earlier, depended upon the masters being able to speak for the slave, to deny his or her humanity, and to draw a line between slave consciousness and human will. Literacy among slaves would expose slavery, and masters knew that. And so since the very beginning, one of the reasons why it was illegal for people of African ancestry to learn to read is because there was a direct connection between education and consciousness. And people were very well aware of that. When you look at Christina DeRocher's book, Raising Races, the Socialization of White Children in Jim Crow South, she even goes further and talks about the actual canon. She says, in their perpetuation of the myth of African-American inferiority, the textbooks and literature white Southerners created for school children reveal how completely white supremacy was embedded in Southern white culture. So again, the classroom, this particular space, the education being the great equalizer, has not always been on a level field when it comes to people of African ancestry. And when you look at Williams H. Watkins' book, The White Architects of Black Education, he says, I have come to understand what people in power have long known. Education can be used to both oppress and liberate. Ideas are indeed powerful things. I further came to understand that America's colonization of Blacks employed the textbook as often as the bullet. I'll say that again, the textbook as often as the bullet. Colonial education in America was designed to control, pacify, and socially subject people. The education of Black Americans has always been inextricably connected to state politics and the labor market, has always been connected. And so there's no way that we can untie or untangle this web that has been woven. And then when we look at the popular cases like Brown versus the Board of Education, and people getting an understanding of what that case meant as far as ending segregation. But one thing that this case revealed was the impact that this type of socialization and education was having on Black children. And one of the things they used was something called the doll test. And when they used the doll test, they had Black children go into a room and they had a white doll and a black doll, and they had them choose between the dolls, and then they saw their findings. A young film student years later in the early 2000s said, I'm going to redo the doll test that was done in 1954 and see if, because of integration, because of this newfound liberal agenda that America professes to be under, has there been any changes? And so we'll look what Kira Davis's findings were.
In Brown versus Board of Education, the famous case that desegregated schools in the 1950s, Dr. Kenneth Clark conducted a doll test with Black children. He asked them to choose between a black doll and a white doll. In most instances, the majority of the children preferred the white doll. I decided to reconduct this test as Dr. Clark did to see how we've progressed since then. Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you like to play with? That one? This one. I like to play with this. And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll? She's white. And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. Can you give, and why does that look bad? Because it's black. And why do you think that's a nice doll? Because she's white. And can you give me the doll that looks like you? "15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll."
So this is how anti-Blackness has manifested itself in education and socializing our communities. And you see it in the desegregation battles. You see it in the Heman Sweat case where he was trying to attend the University of Texas Law School and was denied and sent to the Thurgood Marshall School. But you see it in contemporary education when we had the Jenna 6 case, where these 6 young men in Jenna, Louisiana were treated differently than their white peers when they got into a fight. And they were charged criminally while the white students were disciplined by the education system. You see it when Officer Ben Fields flipped this young girl over in her seat in a classroom because she was being disruptive. And you see it in Riverside, California, and Martin Luther King Jr. High School of all schools, where students were found taking pictures, holding up swastikas and Confederate flags and anti-Black sentiments. And so this is the reason why we're having this conversation, because we have yet to remedy some of those issues. But our people haven't always been victims. Our people are fighters. And so as fighters, you got to understand that our people created schools right after Civil War because we knew the power of education and that we had to seize and grab hold of what was ours in order to educate ourselves. She says, freed people, not northern whites, initiated the educational movement in the South while the Civil War was being fought. Molefe Asante, one of the people credited with coining the term Afrocentricity, says Afrocentricity seeks to respond to the dislocation of the African person by providing philosophical and theoretical guidelines and criteria that are centered in a person's perception of reality. So post-enslavement, we started our freed schools. In contemporary time, people have been moving towards an African-centered curriculum. At a certain point in 1970s, a lot of African Americans just decided to just divorce themselves from the system and started their individual schools and created something called the Council of Independent Black Institutions. But as you can see, we're still fighting. This is from a board meeting last week in Baton Rouge, where they're calling for a council board, education board member to step down because she was not taking their demands seriously. She was online shopping while they were arguing that they should change the name of the high school from Robert E. Lee, named after a Confederate general. And some people may be wondering, why is it such a big deal that these schools are named after Confederates? Well, Don Lemon recently posed a question: would you want to go to Hitler High School? And so I conclude with this. According to Tyrone Howard, individual acts must transform into collective action, and educators can be part of that change. Schools are not immune from the perpetuation of anti-Black racism. Many students, parents, and teachers have long argued that schools are rampant with acts of anti-Black racism. Schools can and should be better, and they must be part of the solution in racial reckoning and healing. If deliberate steps are not taken to end anti-Black racism, it will continue to cause irreparable harm to Black students. It will also leave an indelible imprint on the minds and psyches of non-Black students. So with that being said, I'd like to hand the floor over to my colleague, J. Luke Wood.
Thank you, Lasana, and glad we were able to get things back and going here today. I'm going to go ahead and provide some context as to what we think anti-Blackness looks like in the field of education. So I want to begin by noting that what you're about to see are data that are derived from a number of sources. So one source is the Our Voices project, which is ran by Dar Essian and myself, which looks at how microaggressions manifest in early childhood education. The second set of data is to ask our colleagues what they would like to share with us. So we have their permission to share the post that you will see. So the first is just a general set focused on anti-Blackness. So this is from Crystal Clemens, Frank Harris, and Keith Hodgkins. So the first one from Crystal says that, and this is from Black and Ivory, seeing a white woman counselor educator using the hashtag anti-racist school counseling, but remembering how she wouldn't assist me in advancing my career. And another example, and we see a lot of this in this day and age, where people will say that they support, and they'll post publicly on their social media, and they'll say wonderful things about Black Lives Matter, but when we look at their actions and their language are disaligned. We see another one from Frank here, where he says, when the only time you hear from your dean all year is when they need you to fill a table they purchased at a Black fundraiser. I think that many could relate not only to that, but to also being that the only time that people hear from them is when they need a picture. The other one is from Keith Hodgkins, who's I know joining us today. So hello, Keith. And he says, Black in the Ivory is when you are celebrated for being a phenomenal scholar and told you will earn tenure there. And then finding out that your white male colleague with whom you were hired earned $20,000 more. So looking at how this also plays out in this way. We also then want to talk about the big theme here. A big theme of how anti-Blackness plays out in education is through academic inferiority. And as Lasana mentioned, there's a direct connection between notions of eugenics and notions of intellectual inferiority, and what we see today. So we wanted to go back to the very beginning to start with children in early childhood education. And so here are some quotes from Black girls and boys in kindergarten, early childhood, second grade. So I'll read a few of them. Halfway through kindergarten, a new teacher was assigned to the class. Within the first 2 weeks of being there, she recommended all the Black children, including our daughter, to be tested for special education. She then rearranged all their desks and put them at one desk at the back of the classroom. Another parent said, "My son's second grade teacher did not want to acknowledge the fact that my son was the smartest in her class. Each quarter, students were rewarded based on their achievements on what grade students made. She made sure to give out the white children awards with pride and smiles on her face, even gave each one a little speech on how great they were. Only my Black child's name was called with no excitement and just handed his award with no words." Another parent said, "He had been doing very well, but she consistently treated him like he did not. He constantly had to prove himself in ways that others didn't, even when they didn't. My teacher asked if anyone would like to read aloud, and my son volunteered to do so. However, her tone showed that she didn't think he could read. As soon as he stumbled, only a little bit, she immediately cut him off and asked if anyone else would like to read." Another parent said, "At the beginning of second grade, I met my daughter's teacher. She placed our daughter on a reading level of 15 when she was a 20, the highest in her class last school year. I asked her to retest her because there was no way my daughter was performing that low, especially after our very productive summer. She tested her and said, 'Wow, she is actually smart.' Those actually smart words have stuck with me as a parent. It has been one of the most hurtful responses about my daughter. It was painful because there was doubt that my daughter could perform well." We also see this happening when students are in college. One student said on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, "One instance was when I was in one of my science classes and I was told I was smart for a Black girl." Another student said, "I was asked by a white student in the class if I understood the material being taught out loud while the professor was teaching. I took great offense. Although I do ask a lot of questions, it's not her place to check my understanding. I felt extremely frustrated." And this contribution is from Bo Palmer, who says, "I was on my way to do one of many 40+ presentations at the beginning of the semester. The students were already seated, but the instructor hadn't arrived. I waited by the door. A white male professor walked in and asked, 'Are you the sub?' I replied, 'No, I'm waiting for the instructor.' He said, 'I didn't think so. No way you could be a math professor.' I asked who he was, and he answered, he was an instructor." So we see these patterns across early childhood, we see them in college, and we also see that these are experiences that educators have as well. Those who are in roles as staff members, as was seen in that role, and an example, and here's one in a set that deal with those who are faculty members. I'll start on the top right with the quote from Ramon Goings. "Black in the Ivory, trying to collaborate with a white scholar. They say the topic is not of interest to the field. Then a few years later, you see them with pubs, millions of dollars of grants on the idea you brought them." Other examples of being perceived as having academic inferiority. "Black in the Ivory, when a colleague questions the validity of your publications and external funding because they aren't published in high quality journals or NSF grants." And you'll see what happens when, on the next slide, when we talk about what happens when people publish in quote unquote journals designed for Black populations. Here's one from Juliet Parker, who says, "One curriculum leadership team meeting, a US Black history course was among those reviewed for inclusion on the agenda for the upcoming curriculum committee meeting. A colleague sarcastically blurts out, 'What about Black math? I guess that will be next.' My colleagues roared with laughter, hurled other insults, then looked at me, the only African-American member of the team. My response, 'Do you mean the math the ancient Egyptians created? Or were Black taught by, or the Blacks are taught by the Greeks? The math taught here.' So she was pushing back on this whole notion in terms of where it comes from. Here's an example that came from my own experience when I was a doctoral student. When you're told by a white professor that you should avoid doing qualitative research on Black students because you should have an interpreter because they speak with slang." Another one from Keith Hodgkin says, Black in the Ivory is repeatedly going to the campus Starbucks with white colleagues, and when it's your time to pay the cashier, always ask them to apply the faculty discount. Looks at me and says, that will be $3.13. I respond, I too am faculty. The amazement is ever so jarring. Again, this notion of academic inferiority. But we also see this play out not just with individuals, but also outlets. If we think about our historically Black colleges and universities and how they are viewed with a sense of anti-Blackness, or journals that are designed to uplift research focused on Black populations, how they can also be drawn down. Here's an example from Ramon Goings with a story that's been widely published about a colleague of ours, Paul Harris. And Paul says, when every annual review says you're on track, and then your all-white tenure committee says one of your articles seems to be self-published, the one in the Journal of African American Males in Education, which is not a self-published journal. It is a highly regarded, peer-reviewed outlet that is independent. Dr. Ramon Goings, who happens to be the editor, says, Black in the Ivory is being the editor of the Journal of African American Males in Education, and an all-white tenure committee attempts to claim that the journal is self-published when a simple Google search would lead you to the journal and information that is indeed peer-reviewed. We also see other things that have been said by Ramon. He says, Black in the Ivory, I finished my doctorate and applied for jobs. A search committee said, we're not sure if you can handle R1 since you went to an HBCU and not an institutional peer. Meanwhile, in my 4 years as faculty, I have more pubs than that person in their 20-year career. Similarly, Keith Hotchkins has said, Black in the Ivory is being told, avoid having an external reviewer from an HBCU in your file when you go up for tenure next year. I responded, they earned full, that's full professor, at Rutgers before relocating into an admin role at HBCU. They said, and then left my office. Exhausting indeed. We also see beyond this notion of academic inferiority, the pervasive criminalization that occurs. And again, it begins in early childhood education, both policing and criminalizing, and how that basically serves to mirror the violence that we see committed against Black peoples in society. And this is where we believe that Black lives and Black minds are intertwined, because there is symbolic violence that happens every day in our schools that it mirrors the real violence that we see that takes place in the streets. One preschool example here, a parent said, I volunteered in my preschool classroom. The teacher approached me and tells me, you need to watch out for Jamal. He held the scissors the other day and started swinging it at the other students. The teacher made it seem that Jamal was a villain or a criminal for pretending to use the scissors incorrectly. While she was saying, watch out, Johnny, a white boy in the class, held the same scissors and did the same thing. The teacher said in a nice tone, Johnny, is that the right thing to do? And then carried on to the next lesson. Another parent said, my son's first grade teacher would call home for every little infraction. Some of the punishments were often severe, even for a small thing, and didn't match the crime, such as turning around in his seat one time to result in the whole day being marked as bad. Some of the behavior issues that were written about would happen one time, and the teacher would prolong the punishment instead of dealing with it and moving on. And I'll skip down to the final one. Both of those last two are examples of being singled out. And a parent said, an incident happened where a Caucasian kid pointed out a rainbow, and about 3 other kids looked at it. I remember the main administrator specifically naming and shaming our son. Our son is quiet and tends to follow the crowd. He can get mouthy when questioned, but what kid doesn't when he gets singled out when 4 other kids seem to get a pass? It doesn't help the situation, but I can't blame him. That seems unfair. We also see this happening with college students, being in an elevator or near a person who isn't of color, and they move away as if I was going to do something to them. This was a college junior who's a Black female. This is another one from a college student. It says, one time I was sitting with a few other Black people in a lecture of 300 people, and it was full, and we were told not to sit next to each other during a test when we walked in. We see similar challenges happening in terms of pervasive criminalization. Examples from our colleagues Abdulmalik Bull and Terry Sivers. Abdulmalik says, I was stopped and cuffed in front of the dome that's on campus because I fit the description and had all my classmates walk by me as I was criminalized in broad daylight. Guess how many of them wanted to do group projects with me afterwards? Similarly, Terry Cyber says, stopped by campus police in front of the library and asked what I was doing on campus. About 5 minutes prior, another Black student warned me that a cop was going around harassing Black students. And you can see another example of a very similar situation from Jonathan Henderson on the right. We also see that this happens, of course, to faculty members in other ways, where there are similar, and staff members in other ways, where there is similar policing and criminalization. Frank says, when Luke Wood and Frank Harris are walking across campus together and someone says, here comes trouble. Or on the right-hand side, you can see other examples that I've offered. These are from a prior institution, and I say, Black in the Ivory is when a group of white faculty walk up to you and ask you whether you're a drug dealer because you're always on the phone, and then start laughing at you as if you're the butt of a joke. Black in the Ivory is when they tell you that people see you as aggressive because you stand up when you give presentations. And there's another example that you can see on the left there from Bo Palmer. We also have to recognize that beyond the assumptions of criminality and the ascriptions of intelligence, there's also just simply mistreatment that comes. And it begins early on. And here are some examples, again, beginning with early childhood education. My son's teacher yelled at my son for spilling a little paint. And mind you, it's washable paint. Other kids spilled it too, but it doesn't bother them, only when the Black kids do it. Another parent said, my child was in 2nd grade and his teacher was an older teacher. The child made a joke and his teacher made him cry. She said, 2nd grade is no place for jokes. Then she told another teacher that he is a clown, a class clown, and she made him stand in front of the classroom, including the other teacher and an associate, and they kept it up and made him cry. After making him cry, she also yelled at him. This is to a Black girl in 2nd grade. I'm gonna read the one on the bottom. My son Daryl was a student at a specific school in 1st grade. When he was asked to use the bathroom, the teacher said, wait. Sadly, the child wet his pants. Every student made a joke of it. I felt that the teacher would have been compassionate. This would not have happened to my son. And I can say that unfortunately in the work that I've done with my wife and the research that we've done together, we have seen this as a very common pattern, particularly in early childhood education. And abuse and mistreatment also can happen in college. One student said, I was at a party and people were singing the N-word in a song. A group of my friends and I went up to them and explained why they shouldn't. They ignored us and said it wasn't a big deal. Similarly, and very similar in fact, Bo Palmer says, I was taking a literature class at a local community college where many of our readings included the N-word. This particular faculty had her students sit in a circle and everyone read out loud. There were only 2 Black students. I was one of the 2. I happened to also be staff there. I refused to say the N-word. She kept insisting. She asked me to stay after class, told me that N was just a word and had no meaning. She stopped bothering me about saying the word, but it seemed like the other students had a feast reading it out loud. I cringed every time they said it. And another one from our colleague, Crystal Clemens, who says, a former senior professor asked me to stay after a faculty meeting. When others left, she said she had seen a documentary about Black women sewing on other people's hair. And then she yanked mine and said, is this real? Further examples of this, how this plays out amongst Black faculty and staff. When the dean you work for is let go and another colleague tells you, don't worry, you'll be fine without your master, with the emphasis on the word master. Or when you're the only Black faculty and you have several colleagues who constantly call you boy. And then when you complain, people say, you don't know what you're talking about. Even if somebody had called you a boy, it deals more with your age than with your race. That was at a prior institution. From Ramon Goings, it says, Black in the Ivory is when a student calls you by your first name in the email, but refers to all your white colleagues as Dr. So-and-so. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to our next presenter.
Thank you. Thank you. I was having a little bit of trouble getting unmuted. Can I go to the next slide, please? So thank you very much. The thing that I want to start with is basically telling you these are things that we might be able to do in order to address anti-Blackness. And indeed, there are things that you would be able to do in your positions, but there are also things that you would be able to have your colleagues and members of the institution do. The first thing I want to say, though, is walk in the room and decide to enter this space. Don't stumble into it. Don't fall into it. Decide, be intentional and deliberate in terms of entering in this space, and then be unapologetic about it. Because let me explain, you will be challenged. You will have people question your scholarship. You will have people question your leadership. You will have people question whether you are, making a big deal out of nothing. So understand that this is not work that is for the faint of heart. So if you can't run with the big dogs, then stay on the porch with regard to this work on anti-Blackness. What I would like to give you an example of is when I decided to apply to be the president of a college, I recognized that I was going into, I'm in a county that was not necessarily known for its diversity. I was in San Mateo County. And I went into the process presenting who I am as a leader. So the first thing I did, I want you to know, is that I said to the Board of Trustees as they interviewed me, I said to them, you need to understand my perspective and you need to understand my leadership framework. And this is me interviewing, trying to get the job. And I said, so if these words scare you, then I'm not your best candidate. And the words were, white male supremacy is a universal concept. It is not unique to the United States. It is a pillar upon which this nation was founded, the government was established, and the Constitution was created. White male supremacy influences formal and informal relationships between and among people in public and private spheres of life. Social and political constructions of oppression and discrimination against women and people of color, in particular, people of African descent, remain embedded in American political, economic, religious, and educational institutions, as our colleague, Sister Bell Hooks said. So understand that I walked in explaining that I am a person, a leader, a professional who is committed to anti-Blackness. And I made sure that those words were explicit. They didn't have to search around for them. And then I said, this is my leadership framework. And I provided a leadership framework that is borrowed heavily from Bell Hooks, is a leadership framework called Leading to Transgress. And in Leading to Transgress, it explains from whence the lens through which I see things as a leader, from whence I come, and what perspectives I bring to that work. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to recommend that if you are in the position as educator, and I particularly focus this on the roles of people of influence in the community college system, though it can be used in organizations as well as university segment of education, as well as the secondary segment. But I basically recommend that you develop a comprehensive anti-Blackness framework. And that comes from some of the work of Daryl Smith, who proposed the framework of a comprehensive diversity framework. But in essence, it means look at multiple domains. It's not the, celebration food fun, food thing that says, okay, this is Black History Month and we can do this event and we can have these foods and, and we think we've done something at the institution. But look at the multiple domains of work that you do throughout the institution and understand that you have the ability to impact these multiple domains. So first thing is, let me say, everything matters. You will have colleagues that will say to you, oh, come on, Regina, now, it's not always about race. But until this nation can mitigate the extensive institutionally racist structures in every aspect of society, whether we're talking about healthcare or finance or education or religion or housing or the justice system, it is always about race. And just remember that the whole issue is, the intent is to distract. The intent of racism is to distract. So keep your eye on the prize and understand that it is always about race. In developing a comprehensive anti-Blackness framework, you have to recognize that none of it is small. Everything matters. So you have to be unrelenting. You have to make them tired of you. You have to make them tired of your point of view almost, because racism is exhausting, anti-Blackness is exhausting, so is deconstructing anti-Blackness, so is deconstructing racism. Contemplate the power of your position. At every turn, I had a colleague when as I prepared for this webinar, I asked my colleagues that were across the system on the CIO listserv, the chief instructional officers, the chief student services officers, the chief business officers, and the chief executive officers. And I asked all of them because I perceived them to be in positions to be able to have some power, and that power is the ability to influence, whether it's influence on the direction of an institution or the mobilization of resources. All of them have the ability to influence. So I asked them, what strategies do you use for anti-Blackness, and what do you think we could do in order to be able to have an anti-Blackness framework? And one of my colleagues said, and this was Gregory Anderson down in Riverside, that he said, contemplate the power of the position and understand, be explicit and decisively demonstrate in words and action that biased, discriminatory, adverse, and otherwise inequitable actions are intolerable in every aspect of the operation, in every aspect of the academy, in every aspect of the enterprise. And went on to say, he didn't believe that he could change individuals' minds, but he could change individuals' behaviors, particularly people who wanted to deny Black students and employees and community members their humanity and the right to equitable outcomes. You can change the behaviors. And when they clearly understand that that's not tolerated, then the behavior may change. As an administrator that, or a leader that has an anti-Blackness agenda, pay attention to the climate of the institution. Now, I don't mean to simplify this because institutional climate is, a complex and nuanced thing. But the reality is that you can use your position to make it okay for people to be imperfect as you start to engage in these conversations around race, as you start to address anti-Blackness. You can make it okay for them to be imperfect, but you have to create a space for this conversation, this dialogue to take place. You have to, and that means using your position, providing the types of supports that you can provide to people so that they can be able to challenge themselves, challenge the institution, and be able to grow in many ways. Look at the things that you have influence over. One of the most important roles that we have as CEOs, for an example, is determining who comes into this institution. And yes, you go through different hiring screening processes and have recommendations that come from the faculty committees and from the screening committees, depending on the positions that you are hiring. But first, you have to have a conscious goal that you want to diversify your faculty and staff. And particularly, you have to have a conscious goal that you want to make sure that there is an increased number of African-American faculty and staff in the institution if you're working on an anti-Black agenda. And it is not for the exclusive purpose of having role models for the few Black students that may be there. It is more importantly for the majority, the white student population and other students to see and to recognize and appreciate that African-American faculty member that's there teaching physics, calculus, sociology, psychology, et cetera, to understand that what excellence looks like comes in these different presentations, and that is part of the Black experience as well. Challenge the screening processes. So one of the things I advise people do is use their positions as CEOs to interrupt the processes so that you can change it to err on the side of inclusion, so that you are posing the types of descriptions, the types of questions that you are saying it is explicitly okay to interrogate issues to make sure that candidates will be able to support and be able to serve Black students. I had colleagues tell me of an experience where they were hiring 47 full-time faculty. This was Dr. Scroggins over at Mount SAC, hiring 47 full-time faculty. And out of that process, and the total number, there were 160 Black candidates that were qualified. However, throughout the 47 positions and the processes for those positions, none of those candidates were interviewed. Zero, he said, none. So they actually did a dive into it to say, okay, they dug into what created that? How did we systematically exclude all the Black people? And they found that it had some of those just like me factors in favoring years of experience. So we say all the time, 5 years of experience preferred. What is special about those 5 years that you don't get in 4 years and 8 months, or that you don't get in 4 years and 7 months, or you don't get in 3 years and 10 months? So it's an arbitrary criteria, or requiring degrees or advanced degrees that are beyond the required degrees for being able to carry out the position, or requiring specific experience in the California community colleges, because we in the California Community College have such unique responsibilities in teaching people that if you came from another segment or another sector, you couldn't possibly understand how to teach students that are in the California Community College, because we are doing such a phenomenal job with it, with the kinds of outcomes we have. We are across the nation no more than 20%, 23% of the students actually get through and graduate in a reasonable amount of time within 3 to 6 years. So the kind of exclusion that takes place in the hiring process, you have to be able to confront it, revise the screening process, look at the untoward results, make sure that the screening committee understands the types of candidates that will be successful when they get to you at the second level, and make sure that the screening committee is understanding the lens through which you are seeing or looking at candidates as well. Another domain is the domain of communication. Name it. Talk about anti-Blackness. Well, I had a interesting interview one time, and the candidate was trying to answer a question, an explicit question that we asked about race, which was about something about their outcomes. And I asked questions like, they've been teaching for so many years, they say on their vitae, but they say, I'll say, what are the outcomes of your students, and they say, well, 80% of my students are successful or, pass. Disaggregate that by race. How do Black students do in your physics class? How do Latino students do in your physics class? And literally candidates will say, well, I don't know, I haven't looked at it that way. Well, if you haven't looked at it that way, that means it has never been a question for you. So that means you have not been committed to making sure that students of color, that Black students are successful. That's the information that gives me in the screening process. And I had a candidate that was really trying to talk to me about it without talking about race. And finally, at one point, my colleague, who was a vice president of student services at the time, stopped and said, at this college, we talk explicitly about race. You don't have to shy away from it in the middle of the interview process. So we create this space so we understand. We talk explicitly about race. You make sure that you avoid things like color muting and whitewashing and all of the other things, anything from code shifting to dog whistling. Be explicit in talking about anti-Blackness. Introduce and feed that narrative. Make it such that they can anticipate that. I don't care if you're talking about what time the library is going to close. There's going to be an anti-Black statement. There's going to be an anti-racism statement in your announcement or your presentation. Ask open-ended questions about race and incorporate it in your everyday, day-to-day business. Look at your policies. When you look at the domain of policies, review your policies with an equity lens, see who's hurt and who's excluded and who's marginalized and who's disenfranchised by what policies, who is privileged, and what system does it maintain. I remember that we were addressing the issue of AB 705, which is the assessment prerequisites issue into getting into math and English. And I remember challenging the faculty as we met for, I want to say three semesters, while we, engaged in this exercise of, what I call these exercise of privilege, where we get to debate for a year and a half whether the GPA should be 2.6 or 2.7 for the entry into a particular math class. One, as if the GPA has standing and merit and predictability. But the other thing is that that means that there are 3 cohorts of students that could have progressed on with access to this instruction, which is the key to being able to finalize and get the degree. That's 3 cohorts of students that we've missed because we're sitting here arguing about whether it should be a 2.6 or a 2.7, or as if there's some science to that. Have your board adopt statements, but they have to go beyond statements. They have to be incorporated in different plans. When you look at your strategic plan, for an example, if that is the thing that drives the allocation of your resources, start the strategic plan with the first statement about your commitment to anti-racism, to anti-Blackness, to social justice. That should be the first sentence almost in the strategic plan, or if not showing up in the first paragraph. Take some bold stuff because, people are afraid that you're gonna scare people away from reading it. Review your contracts and pay attention to the sections that privilege certain groups of people and that maintain the status quo. And don't get me started on things like the hiring contracts, the contract with regard to faculty evaluation, the contract with regard to the allocation of resources for department chairs and those types of things. Those types of negotiated arrangements hold in check anti-Black systems. They hold in check. So you can be at predominantly an institution that predominantly serves people of color, and you still would look at predominantly that your faculty and people that are in positions that influence these students' lives would classify themselves as white. And that is not that is by design, and it's codified processes that are in your contracts that maintain it, so they're in your policy. So pay attention to your operational policies. Look for all of the formal and informal rules that govern your operation. And don't be content, as one of my colleagues suggested, don't be content to blame the difficulty in doing this work. Well, you know how it is. We have to have participatory governance, or we have to bargain it, or there'll be a lot of social backlash if we do this. Don't be content that is the sufficient excuse for you not doing something, for you not taking something on. I had to adopt a perspective that what people think about me is not my business, because I knew that I was going to be taking on certain sacred cows, and that I was not going to necessarily be the person that that's people spoke well of in that regard. But I am not willing to behave. I am not willing to support anti-Blackness. I am not willing to maintain systems of white supremacy so that others will think well of me. Pay attention to your structures as well. Look at the opportunities that you have through all of your professional organizations. Many of us are in positions where we can influence, for example, the theme of the conference. Now, the theme of the conference is one of my little pet peeves, because we always try to come up with some kind of gimmick or something really witty, whether it's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom or whatever it might be that is the theme of the conference. Do like my colleague Pam Luster, when she became the head of the president of the CEOs, she brought in, first thing, walking in the door, first day on the job almost, she brought in the issue from her perspective of equity and addressing issues of racism. And so she brought in an anti-racist agenda in the space where she had some influence. Now, amongst all of the colleagues, you can imagine there are some people that were really congratulating that and thankful for that. And there were some people that are like, oh gosh, so we're going to be doing this politically correct stuff. So use your position of influence and consequence to be able to bring in the anti-Black agenda at any space that you can. Take a look at your practices, go beyond having the statements. Incentivize anti-Blackness. We're in positions to be able to mobilize resources and make things happen. As I say all the time, I'm not above or below buying friends and influencing people. So mobilize those resources in order to make things happen. One of my colleagues, Mary Gutierrez, said, she's at DVC, and she said, every dollar we spend should be driving equity incomes, and our thinking and speaking should reflect that. She said, our general funds are our anti-racist funds, and they need to work toward that end. So that is a whole different way of thinking about it. And then finally, take a look at the professional development opportunities, invest in professional development, be explicit. And you have to be explicit and create an infrastructure that it doesn't go away when the news cycle about Mr. Floyd dies down, or when the news cycle about Black Lives Matters dies down. You have created an infrastructure in that institution that will sustain a commitment to anti-Blackness, that will sustain a commitment to anti-racism. And with that, I'm going to pause and say there are many, many more things that I would love to offer to suggest to us as colleagues about different things that we can do, but that's a start. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Frank Harris.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stanback-Stroud. What I'm going to do is to bring all of the wonderful ideas and suggestions and strategies that have been discussed thus far, to bring it all together in one, final piece of the webinar. And I'm going to move through this relatively quickly so we could have some time for Q&A and try to make up some of the time that we lost with the technical issues that we uncovered. But I think that the key idea here is that this is not intended, the strategies we share are not intended to be a sequential list of things that you should do. And they're not, they shouldn't necessarily be pursued mutually exclusively in a disjointed way. This all has to be a part of what Dr. Stanback-Stroud just described as a comprehensive anti-Blackness framework. Next slide. Next slide. So first and foremost, institutions that are authentically committed to addressing anti-Blackness must have a transparent reconciliation of the ways in which anti-Blackness and white supremacy is at the core of its history and legacy. So for example, the institution should learn about how were Black bodies used as labor and capital to build and fund the institution. It also entails identifying racist institutional policies and practices that have both denied access to the institution for Blacks and sanctioned racialized trauma that Blacks have experienced since the institution's origins. Some institutions may find it valuable to convene a task force to lead this effort, and if so, it should be comprised of a broad group of stakeholders, including faculty, staff, students, and community members. And it would be important to have someone who has some expertise in history and who's perhaps done some archival research to help guide the work of this group. And it's also very, very important to share the findings of this effort in a town hall meeting and in a report that is publicly available on the institution's website. Another key step here in terms of reconciling the history and legacy of anti-Blackness is to do a comprehensive audit of campus rituals, symbols, and artifacts that are rooted in racism. So this includes campus statues, buildings, songs that are played by the band, the mascot, and all other traditions. And be sure not to overlook the campus Greek system, which tends to be kind of a hotbed for racist traditions on many campuses. School districts should also review the names of every school and change those that are named after people who have committed racial atrocities or were engaged in efforts to advance racism. And then finally, you have to identify tangible ways to atone for the history of racism against Blacks. So for example, you might consider creating a scholarship fund for Black students, You might name an important campus program after a prominent Black alum, particularly someone who was among the first to attend and graduate from the institution. You might decide to waive tuition and fees for Black students for a period of time. Or you might establish an endowed professorship for faculty who are committed to conducting research that improves the life conditions and education of Black students. Next slide. All right, so next, our comprehensive plan must include an intentional approach to lifting Black voices, both students and employees. Now, this is important in that being able to tell your story can be both instructive for the institution, but can also be healing, for those who get the opportunity to tell it and who've been targeted and disadvantaged by anti-Black racism. Now, this needs to be done systematically and it needs to be done rigorously. There should be interviews and focus groups. And the questions that should guide this inquiry should be focused on the experiences with anti-Blackness in the context and the ways in which the institution can be better and more responsive at eliminating anti-Blackness. And then also making sure that you're reaching out to, you recognize that while, as Blacks, we have a shared racial and ethnic identity, but we're not all the same. And so it's essential to take an intersectional approach to looking at, how does Black racial and ethnic identity intersect with other salient identities? And we see, several that were presented here on the slide. And then with regard to employees, you should also seek out the voices and perspectives of employees and making sure that you're engaging a broad cross-section of them. So not just the folks in one unit, for example, but thinking about folks who might be working in spaces like information technology, custodial services, maintenance, and again, these are all just examples. Above all, believe what they tell you, because far too often we have institutions who engage in these types of inquiries and they don't leverage the findings because they don't like what they've heard. And there tends to be an effort to discredit them. So, and this is what ultimately allows anti-Blackness to persist. And then if you're using any type of external consultants to do this, a quick word of advice is to make sure that the contract includes presentations to students and the board and faculty and the community to make sure that you have this person who could help communicate and disseminate the findings. Next slide. So Dr. Steinbeck-Stroud spent quite a bit of time discussing this. So I won't belabor this third point too much. But I will say that, we have to be intentional in addressing anti-Blackness throughout the campus culture. Because it's so deeply embedded in institutional cultures, it can have a pervasive but hidden impact in every system, process, and structure in the institutions. So, some places that you might think about, for example, the context of teaching and learning. When we take a critical look at the curriculum of certain disciplines, we can find that Black voices, perspectives, and contributions to the field are largely absent. And Black students rarely see positive images of themselves or their histories in the curriculum. And most of what is taught has nothing to do with their racialized lived experiences. So when we sort of state this simply, most curricula and curricular review processes help to systematically advance white supremacy. When we look at student services, when we look at the experiences of Black students in predominantly white classes, we find that they're both invisible and that they're often one of few. And, we couple this with the fact that these courses in this space are rarely, if ever, taught by a Black faculty member. You have a curriculum that's lacking Black perspectives. It's easy to see why Black students often feel invisible in these spaces. Yet at the same time, Black students are hyper aware that others in this space are watching them. Everyone notices when they come in a few minutes late. Faculty are watching them closely to make sure they're not cheating on exams. And when the topics of crime, violence, slavery, or civil rights emerge, everyone is looking at them and expects them to share their perspective. Mm-hmm. So there's this weird dichotomy of being both invisible, but also being hyper surveilled that is rooted in the experiences of Black students. And then, there's been a lot of discussion about racial microaggressions that are persistent, that often go unchecked. And I think Dr. Wood, spoke about that earlier, so I won't say much more about that. And then when we look at the context of student services, we see three consistent patterns of anti-Blackness. The first is where Black students are underserved and not afforded the same attention, effort, and support from student services professionals that are often given to other students. The second is being under challenge, where Black students are directed to less challenging programs or coursework and questioned when they desire to pursue things like AP classes or middle college or science curriculum, for example. And the third is being unwelcome. And this is that Black students are often treated as though they don't belong in colleges, universities, libraries, or other academic spaces. And again, I know Dr. Stanbeck Stroud did a great job of sort of unpacking human resources and anti-Blackness, but these are some areas that we want to be intentional in looking at as well. Next slide. So student discipline and conduct is another area that requires a critical and racially conscious examination within any framework of anti-Blackness. Now, this needs to start with an examination of school discipline data that is disaggregated by race, ethnicity. So we know from the published work in this area that Black boys and Black girls are more likely to be suspended or expelled than any other racial, ethnic, and gender group in public schools. And so this is another strategy that can be taken on by a specially appointed task force. So some questions to consider are presented here on the slide. But the one that I really would like to call attention to is the de facto suspensions. And by de facto, we mean that when you have removals from class that do not show up in the data as a suspension, but that essentially have the same effect. So sometimes these are referred to as in-school suspensions, but they're not always referred to that way. The key point here is that we need to pay very close attention to this practice, as it usually won't show up in the data. And then colleges can do a similar examination using student conduct data and the questions that are presented on the slide here as well. We understand that many colleges and universities don't have systems that keep track of data in these ways. So one important implication of this is that every institution needs to start doing so, keeping track of student conduct data in a way that would allow it to be disaggregated by race and ethnicity, I would say almost immediately. Next slide. So we know that the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Rayshard Brooks, to name a few, have increased the attention that have been directed towards law enforcement in the anti-Blackness movement and have called for comprehensive reforms, including defunding the police. Now, most campus police are sworn officers and undergo the same training and socialization as city and county law enforcement. Therefore, school and campus leaders need to prioritize the ways in which police engage students in general and Black students in particular. So one place to start would be to do an analysis of campus data, looking at the representation of Black students in arrests, citations, complaints, and referrals from faculty members, which on college campuses comprise a substantial proportion of the ways in which Black students are engaged by law enforcement. And again, if these data are not available, now would be a good time to start tracking it systematically. Campus leaders also need to take a more serious look at the complaints that are filed by students that allege mistreatment on the basis of race, ethnicity. There needs to be a clear and transparent protocol for how these complaints are handled and a process for reporting the outcomes of them. Next, we don't usually talk about cultural proficiency as a necessary competency for law enforcement, but let me explain why this is really important. Police officers who work in colleges and schools are educators. Therefore, they need to be able to engage Black students in the same way that we would expect faculty and staff to engage them. Therefore, we call for an assessment of cultural proficiency to be included in the hiring process for all law enforcement professionals who will be working in schools and colleges. This also needs to be included amongst the criteria that are used to evaluate their performance. And moreover, schools and campus law enforcement must have intrusive and ongoing professional learning that focuses on key issues related to anti-Blackness. And then, there's some other ideas here related to having an advisory board and also engaging in some humanizing and relationship building practices for law enforcement. Next slide. Right now, we see many institutions releasing statements of support and solidarity in response to anti-Black racism. And these are nice and they feel good, but far too many are devoid of concrete actions that will be taken to address anti-Blackness within the institution. Another trend we see is institutions saying that they'll host listening sessions and healing circles for Black students, faculty, and staff to express their pain. Again, this is a good first step, but it doesn't address anti-Blackness at the institution. So here's some things we can do to move us closer to where we need to be. And again, Dr. Stanback Stroud talked about this, about, we know that institutional strategic plans are ultimately what determines what an institution will invest in. So if addressing anti-Blackness is indeed a priority, it needs to be articulated in the strategic plan with a set of measurable goals and resources that are allocated specifically for this purpose. And then we can say the same thing about mission statements needing to be clearly focused and articulate anti-racism as a shared institutional value. I also want to talk about governing boards, because far too often the governing board is removed from the real on the ground issues that are taking place at an institution. But if we expect systemic change to occur, they must be deeply engaged and committed to anti-racism. One way that we can go about doing so is adding an standing agenda item that talks about what the institution is doing to address anti-Blackness. This not only keeps the governing board informed, it also puts these efforts on the official record. And there should be more Black representation on governing boards. I know this has been a real challenge in politically conservative communities and in institutions where anti-Blackness is prevalent. But one thing we know is that representation matters. And just like we need to have more Black faculty and staff at most institutions, the same is true for governing boards. Everything that I just said about governing boards also applies to parent-teacher associations and school site councils. And then last point here is that in this day and age, it's irresponsible for an institution not to have clear policies on hate crimes and hate speech. So if you don't have this, now is probably a good time to do so. Next slide. Next recommendation is to develop, and this is primarily for colleges and universities, but at times like this, Black students need to have a safe place to go for support and affirmation. And Black resource centers have served this function for decades, as early as the 1960s, with the emergence of ethnic studies on college and university campuses. Dr. Lori Patton has written extensively on this and the ways in which Black resource centers contribute to student learning and success. One of the big misconceptions that's addressed in her work is that these centers are only for Black students, when in fact they serve Black faculty and staff as well. And they do the important work of educating the entire campus community on Black lives and Black issues. So I encourage your institution, if you're looking to establish a BRC, be sure to consult Dr. Patton's work as well. And next slide. One of the most persistent and transparent indicators of anti-Blackness is when Black students don't achieve the same outcomes as their white peers. This is the case at far too many institutions. Therefore, student success data must be disaggregated on a routine basis at the institutional, department, and program levels to identify where Black students are experiencing equity gaps. Our colleagues in the California community colleges do one of the best jobs of this that I've seen, in part because there's a transparent commitment to equity planning, and there's actually dedicated funding that enables them to do so. Dr. Estella Ben-Simone, who we all know and love, developed a framework called the Equity Scorecard that gives institutions some guidance on the data they need to be examining on a regular basis in the areas of access, retention, campus effort, and excellence. And most of the indicators you see here are presented for colleges and universities. However, a similar framework can be applied to schools and districts. It's important to not just look at these data, but also to engage in critical dialogue and sense-making with colleagues about these data. Next slide. A comprehensive approach to addressing anti-Blackness should also entail reaching out to the Black community when acts of racism occur. Now, again, this goes beyond the vague statements that institutions usually send when something like this happens. There should be a team of faculty and staff who are deployed to do this immediately. And the messaging should focus on some of the things that we see here presented on the slide. The more personal you can be with the outreach, the better it is. So a phone call is better than a blanket email or a text. But above all, make sure there's a process for students to request additional support. For example, one campus recently engaged in this type of outreach in response to the George Floyd murder and found that students needed support around employment, basic needs, and other issues that were not necessarily directly related to the issue that prompted the outreach, but were still salient issues and concerns. And then I would also suggest doing something similar for Black faculty and staff as well when these type of incidents occur. Next and last slide. So institutions must make a commitment to building a culture of eliminating anti-Blackness. And one of the most persistent barriers to achieving this goal is that most faculty and staff do not have the conceptual framework and have not been exposed to the theories, research, and concepts that are necessary to really understand systemic racism and white supremacy. Now, this is true even amongst allies and those who are leading efforts relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion on their campuses. So a very important step towards addressing anti-Blackness is to provide opportunities for ongoing professional learning across the campus so that everyone can build their capabilities to engage in critical dialogue and employ concrete actions. The Black Minds Matters course that Dr. Wood has hosted the past 2 years is an example of the deep and intentional professional learning that needs to happen. And in addition, Luke, can you go back to the previous slide? Lasana Hotep regularly offers this list of essential readings as well. And remember, this strategy is not just about professional learning and exposure to anti-Black work. It's about acquiring the tools that are necessary to engage in larger efforts towards systemic change. Next slide. So this slide here talks about the Black Minds Matter course. I think this will be the third launching of the course that's going to occur beginning July 16th. So take a look at the link if you want to have the opportunity to engage in this valuable learning opportunity as well. I know it doesn't cost anything, and there's potentially some continuing education credits that may be available. So go to the link for details there. And with that, I know we've exceeded our time, but we can take as much time as we have available to answer any questions that have arisen. Thank you. And as a reminder, you can ask questions in one of three ways. If you are joining us on Zoom, you could use the chat window or the Q&A option to do it. You could also use the hashtag Black Minds Matter and pose a question on social media. And you could ask a question in the comments on YouTube. It would be helpful, but not required if you can direct your inquiry to a particular panelist, if that's possible, if that's appropriate, given the focus of your question.
So I've gotten a couple of questions about the same thing, and so I can go ahead and start, Frank. Several people have asked about anti-Blackness. Is this a situation of a white-Black binary, or is this more complex than that? And I just want to say that, and I'll start with my answer, and then I'd like to see other folks weigh in on this. But anti-Blackness is a concept that is extended to Black peoples by people of all backgrounds. It does certainly happen from white communities, but can also happen from communities that are non-white, such as the Latinx community, the Asian Pacific Islander community, the Native community. There's other communities that can certainly have anti-Black perspectives and then carry those perspectives out. And so I think that we have to view this as not necessarily a binary, but an issue that and this is why we kind of push on this concept of anti-Blackness, is that you can have individuals who may be united in fighting against racism, but doesn't mean they're willing to do so when it comes to the unique manifestation of anti-Blackness and Black racism. I'll also say that there can be, to a certain degree, anti-Blackness also that exists within the Black community. We definitely see in some places that people who are of a lighter skin tone and straighter hair can be extolled even within their own Black community in ways that those who are of a darker hue are not. But that being said, our focus really here has been on really how organizations and people within organizations perpetuate anti-Blackness on a daily and pervasive level. but I'd like to hear the other panelists weigh in on that.
Luke Lasano wants to weigh in, but he has to be unmuted.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, yes. Anti-Blackness is not a black-white binary. For the equity training series that we developed, we had one of our presenters come, and it was Dr. Robin DeAngelo. And what she did was she had groups self-identify by particular cultural, ethnic backgrounds and had them sit in particular areas in the room. And so she had people who identified as Latinx, people who identified as Black African-American, people who identified as white, people who identified as Asian Pacific Islander, and any other type of categorizations that they self-identified. And so once she got everybody in their area, she told everybody, now discuss how anti-Blackness works in your community. And that's why we're having this specific conversation about anti-Blackness, is because of the way that the racial hierarchy had been developed during those so-called Enlightenment thinkers. And white power has been solidified in a lot of ways based on the securing of resources, based on controlling economic systems, and based on distributing power. A lot of folks within that spectrum, from the white or Caucasian mean at the top and the Negro or Black mean at the bottom, have tried to stratify and try to identify how close they are with the white. And one of the ways in which you identify how close you are with the white is to show how anti-Black that you are. And for some communities, that's like a rite of passage, especially when they come from other places into areas where there's a significant number of Black people. It's one of the ways in which you get accepted and assimilate, is to be able to demonstrate your anti-Blackness. And to Luke's point, anti-Blackness plays itself out within our community. Our community tend to call it colorism, but it is a form of anti-Blackness because it's still rooted in this notion that there is something inferior, something wrong. There is a problem with people of African descent, and your goal is to either try to disassociate yourself if you're from that particular group and try to find out every other cultural heritage that you have, or if you're not from that group, how to show how your allegiance is with the white, the people who are categorized as white, and not with people who are categorized as Black. And it plays itself out in every aspect of life throughout the nation, and in a lot of cases throughout the globe.
Yes, also, if I can just add to that. So first of all, thanks, Latanya, for making that point. But I also want to just raise the idea that even the question itself is the constant perpetuation of white as the standard and the norm, and then everything else revolving around that. So if there was going to be, the question around anti-Blackness is not whether it's a binary between anything else other than white. And that is because we are accustomed to that habit of mind in establishing white as the standard or as the norm, that everything else is juxtaposed to or bounced against as we interrogate these issues. So I'm willing to even question the fact that I have that question.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna take on and read the next point and see if anybody wants to respond to it. It says a faculty member included a reading from a letter from a Birmingham jail, and it includes the N-word. She allowed students to say the word in class when discussing the article. One of our students reported it, and then we followed up. In general, should all faculty know to include a warning in the syllabus that the reading may include the N-word, but the faculty member should inform students that they cannot say the word in class? This has happened a few times in the past with various readings in classes and follow-up questions. Who would like to take that?
I can take this one. So this is a question that we've gotten often over the years, and it's really framed around making sure that students have exposure to core readings and the canons and things like that, we often hear it framed around the work of, I think it's Huck Finn or, some other literary works. But my perspective on this is that the N-word should not be allowed to be used for any reason in any educational learning context. It's traumatizing, it's triggering, and it's not conducive to student learning and student success. So, my perspective on this as an educator is that it shouldn't be used. We shouldn't allow it. And, I know that, there may be other perspectives on this, but this is a pretty unequivocal issue for me.
Okay, the next question it comes from the YouTube feed, and it says, how can an individual address comments of violence against Black people within Black communities and by Black people? Lasana or Regina, would either one of you want to take that?
They're muted again.
I didn't mute them.
Thank you. Yes, so before I take that question, Luke, may I just recommend that the question that was asked about the use of the N-word, Ta-Nehisi Coates did a remarkable explanation on why the N-word shouldn't be used, why white people particularly can't use the N-word, even if they are amongst the constant use of it. It's a remarkable explanation. And if you just Google Ta-Nehisi Coates and N-word, it'll come up on a Vox article, and he does a remarkable job. And then I'm going to leave the next question that you asked to Lasana.
Okay, so the question was, how can an individual address comments of violence against Black people within Black communities and by Black people? I don't know what context that is. If that's the Black on Black crime argument, 85% of crimes committed against white people are by white people, but no one phrased it white on white crime. People typically commit crime and violence in people in proximity. And since we're a highly segregated society, that's what happens. So I don't know if it's in juxtaposition to something else. And just assuming that it's in juxtaposition to something else, when people talk about intergroup violence in terms of Black people in relationship to our ability to mobilize and organize and speak out against when a violent act or a murderous act takes place by police, is that I tell people, I said, are you saying that the common person on the street is held to the same standard as the police department as far as training, accountability, and resources? And if you're talking about things, when people talk about so-called gangs or street organizations, are you holding a Crip or Blood to the same standard as an LAPD officer or an SDPD officer or an Oakland police officer? Are you saying that they are in the same category in society? And so I don't know what to say about Black on Black violence, because most violence, if you look at any Department of Justice data on violence, it's intergroup, because people commit the crimes and commit violence within their group. But if it's in, why do we not mobilize, which we do mobilize, it's just not televised as much around violence that happens within our communities versus when it happens to police, because a police member is not a vice lord and they should not be treated the same way.
Okay, the next question says, the topic of representation of Blacks and their stories has come up at college campuses that I work at. While discussing possible texts, a concern came up about possibly triggering our Black students. Gina, do you want to respond to that one?
Concern came up about triggering Black students?
Yes, when the topics of representation and their stories come up.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that Black students have to be given some of the same respects that any other student would be given, because commonly when there's a discussion or a request for their story, it is usually in the construct of some deficit discussion. You know, there's a discussion about overcoming barriers or not having certain things or having to navigate, violent neighborhood or all of those different types of things, or having experienced assault and those types of things, where then, we turn to the Black students and so tell us about it. And when we're talking about achievement and academic accomplishment and, things that, people would be particularly proud of, then they're not looking to Black students to talk about, to represent and tell their stories. And then it's overlaid with this expectation that then that one Black student in the class or those two Black students in the class speak for and represent the thinking of all Black people. So you've gotten the Black perspective. That's a tremendous responsibility to place on a young student who's trying to navigate their way through this predominantly white institution. Typically, is their experience.
Okay, we're going to take one last question and then we'll conclude. And this one asks about this framework. It says, do you think there is any risk in codifying a proposed anti-Blackness framework whereby in its own right, it becomes authoritarian in its enforcement or oppressiveness in its policing? Lasana, you want to respond to that? Or Frank?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, Luke.
Yep, same here. I was going to say the same thing.
I think what they're saying is sometimes when you create a framework, it then creates confines for how we think about things, and then therefore it can become oppressive in its own nature.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just got unmuted. So every framework has its challenges where it can become policing or oppressive, and no matter what it is, because that's just the nature of a framework. You're eliminating particular things and you're concentrating other things, but not in the sense of anti-Blackness. I think that it's high time that we develop frameworks of anti-Blackness and address these frameworks. And I'm partnering with Cora to work on an anti-Blackness course that you will be able to find at Cora shortly. Luke can speak more about that afterwards. But we're developing these frameworks not on the end of being concerned about the policing or the oppressiveness, but on the end to be able to give some type of way in which to analyze and to benchmark and to go into critical self-reflection as organizations and institutions on where we are in terms of anti-Blackness. A lot of folks see the uprisings in the streets and think that there's something that's acute, that is just like, oh, wow, it's this one thing or it's these two things. No, this is a representation of millennia of treatment of people of African ancestry, and it just manifests itself in these particular moments in time. And so the frameworks will allow us to finally get away from the dismissiveness and the dehumanization and the putting on the margins and the putting on the back burner these legitimate issues and concerns that Black people have been sharing in various ways throughout our existence here. Luke went through a whole thing about Twitter, but if you go all the way back to Frederick Douglass, in the broadsides they were publishing, in the books they were publishing, in the narratives they were publishing, the Twitter experiences are just a contemporary version of us saying, these are all the different ways in which I'm dehumanized and devalued as a person of color in these spaces, and especially as a Black person of color in these spaces. So it's very important that we create the frameworks and then as much as we can control from those areas where it might become a policing issue.
Okay, well, with that, I'm gonna go ahead and close out. There's been a lot of questions about will this recording be made available. I will say yes, but we'll also make sure that we splice the two sections of this together, given that we had that Zoom glitch at the beginning. We're very appreciative for those who tuned in. There was a really good turnout today. We are hoping that we'll see many of you on Black Minds Matter coming up shortly as well. And we'll be following up with a link that will bring you to the recorded version of this that will be cleaned up, as well as any additional resources, such as the reading list that was offered by Lasana. We appreciate your time. We thank you for your commitment to confronting and dismantling anti-Blackness. And we hope that you all have a good rest of your day.